Hello, everybody, and welcome back to DejaVue.
It's your favorite Vue podcast. You just don't know it yet. Although we're like 35, 36 episodes in, so maybe at this point you've already figured out whether you like this podcast or not. And if you don't like it, then why are you still here, is my question.
Yeah,
But
you should write a comment why you don't like it. Like, give us some constructive criticism,
yeah,
and
please.
tell us. Or if you like it, then watch all the previous episodes. Maybe it's not your first episode here and you know all of them. Nevertheless, we're here to talk about a topic that's relevant for all of us, error handling, right? But before we come to that, a quick hint, there's the State of JS survey open right now. Link for that also in the show notes / description. So if you want to vote for, well, not only your favorite framework, but also maybe your favorite podcast or content creators, that's up to you. You can do that now. So it would be nice if you could, well, share some nice inputs there and give in your opinion.
Yeah, so today we're going to cover error handling. So sort of starting from the big picture with like full page errors, then moving down to more fine-grained component level stuff, and then even like more request-based things. So we're going to start big and sort of narrow our way in. And so to start, we've got page errors. And so in lots of places that I've worked at, this is all that we ever really did. We had an error and we would just say, well, there's an error, and throw up, I don't know, like a full page screen, kind of get rid of everything that was on the page and just say, hey, something broke. Sorry about that. Maybe it wasn't even like a customized error message. It was just a pretty generic error message saying, retry whatever you just did. And that was basically it.
Yeah, like these are, oh, yeah, something wrong. Please try again later. I always feel like these are the horrible, like the most horrible server like error messages you can ever get, because you never know, like, okay, is it on them, like on you as a developer? Is it on the user? Like, did I do something wrong with the application? So yeah, I mean, sometimes you don't have any chance, right? You just say like, okay, something went wrong. Not sure what exactly. So I have to just like blow up the whole application and be like, okay, that's it. But in lots of cases, there are better ways, which we'll go through after talking about the page errors, of course. And I think before we get into the details as well, like the error message, it's so important that if you at least have some information about it, and it would be good to know, okay, what's the problem and how to solve it. Like, I don't know, let's say you register and you give in your email, then you also don't want to say like, oh yeah, can't register account. You want to say like, oh yeah, this email is already registered, and maybe give a solution like, hey, do you just forget your password and click here to get a new one? Mm-hmm. So it's also important to be very intentional with the error message. And even if you just add the reason, that's a good start. But there's definitely more that can help the user and make them happy again after seeing errors.
Yeah. And so the way that like Vue comes with this error handler with that like a global thing. So if you have any errors anywhere in your Vue app, they get bubbled up, just like, you know, an event or like an error in any JavaScript application gets. If it's not caught anywhere else, then it gets, you know, it keeps going up and up and up, and then it gets to the top level, and then you handle it there. And often when we handle this, we're hooking into some sort of like third-party service to track these errors, like Sentry, Bugsnag, Rollbar. They let us track the errors, and we can come in later and see what happened and help us debug some of the things that are going on there.
Exactly. And then, of course, you might want to show that error message saying, oh, yeah, no clue what happened here, because if it bubbles up that far and was not caught before, then yeah, you might simply not know. Or maybe you have some general logic like, oh, if it's, I don't know, a 401 error, so like, hey, that user is not authenticated anymore, let's throw them out, and not show an internal server error, but more like, hey, you're not registered, like you're not logged in anymore, not authenticated, so please do that again. So there's also a good space for that. And yeah, in plain Vue, as you said before, you have this wonderful global error handler that you can configure, and that works in any kind of Vue application. So that's at least a good level to start, and also to make sure that you have your error checking set up nicely.
Yeah, at that point, because you've lost some of the context of what was going on, you do get the error. I don't know, do you get where the error was from? I'm not sure on that detail, but
You should get a stack trace. Yeah, probably.
Yeah, but I mean, at that point, it's much harder to give an appropriate error message or whatever. And yeah, but definitely a good first step.
Exactly. And there are a few more things that you can do if you're using Nuxt.js, if it comes to like coarse, so like coarse errors, like just throwing up an error message. But there it's also important to make a distinction between server-side errors and client-side errors, because if you have a big SPA, right, and then there's something happening, as said before, on a client, then you don't always have to throw up that error page. But if you have an error on the server side, well, then the request can't really finish. You don't get any HTML back, so you don't really have another choice. You have to say like, okay, here's an error. Maybe you can still guess based on the status code what went wrong. Maybe there's an, I don't know, API that says, hey, too many requests, sorry, I'm out. So you might get that information still, but all in all, yeah, you can't do much then say, hey, sorry, site not reachable. So you really want to track these errors and make sure they rarely or ideally never happen.
Yeah, for sure. And I've been confused by this myself. The differences between the client side and the server side errors in Nuxt. And so through mastering Nuxt, I encountered this and I ended up writing an article or a couple articles even on error handling and like realizing that. So Nuxt comes with these methods like clear error or use error. And that uses these like global server side set errors, which is different than these like the error that you get with the NuxtErrorBoundary component.
Which we'll also talk about in a bit, exactly.
Yes.
But it's more like of a global versus local error problem, a bit like with global
Yeah.
state and local state. That like if you clear global state, then local state might still be there, and all of that. But that's a really good point. Also, links to the articles will be, of course, also in the description/show notes. That's the least we can do, right? So yeah, that's definitely helpful. There is also an error.vue page that is shown if there's like an uncaught error in Nuxt. So if you set it up, I would always recommend that, even a simple one with your own like branding and stuff, or some fun cat GIFs, like what I usually tend to do. Otherwise, there's a default one as well, because you at least want to show something. So that's nice. And you can also throw an error in Nuxt and then say with a throw create error, you can decide, is it a local error? So just by doing that, or is it a fatal error? And you should actually show the page by saying fatal true. So also there you have the choice of either saying, okay, this component will error out, so we're then at a component level, or you know what, this is that problematic, we'll need to show that good old 500 internal error or whatever error is error page there.
Yeah, and in that error page, you can get some information of the error, like the status code and the actual error message itself. And so you can kind of like what we were saying before with maybe show like some different error messages based on like, oh, you got a 401 or a 500. You can have a little bit of nuance there, not a lot, but you can still show some different things, maybe give the user some different actions there. Again, it's the same kind of problem you're solving, but with Nuxt, it's in a special error page versus in Vue, you've got to, put that together yourself.
Exactly. And if you still want to have some kind of global handler, so to say, there's also the Vue arrow hook in Nuxt. So it's a runtime hook. It's always important to differentiate between build time hooks and runtime hooks. Also, it runs on the client, right? So whenever there's a Vue error, that will also be fed in there. And then you can also do things like show a toast or log that and so on. So there's also plenty of space there, which is pretty lovely. And also the Vue arrow hook is used under the hood for the NuxtErrorBoundary component, which we'll talk about in a bit. I think besides that, also a very common question that people see, like, we have this $fetch for data fetching, which we talked about in a previous episode, which you definitely take a look at, about data fetching in Vue and Nuxt. And a lot of people are like, okay, how can we do global error handling? Because, of course, if your fetch request fails, that doesn't mean necessarily your Vue application will output an error, right? So then people are like, okay, how can we do that? And commonly, it's the easiest way to say, okay, I might want to have different ways of handling errors based on the API calls. So you can create your own $fetch instance, and then you have interceptors there and say, okay, if the response is an error, then you can do stuff, and you can register that in a Nuxt plugin, and then just make sure, all right, makes sense. I will then call something. I will forward an error with Vue arrow hook, or I'll show a toast or whatsoever. So if you need something more global that works there, otherwise you can also do it per request if you have different actions there as well. You can even combine both approaches.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think I haven't used the those interceptors very much, and so I always forget that they're there because you know, I just haven't gotten used to using them yet.
I think also like it's not something I would use every day because especially
Mm-hmm.
with like use fetch, use data, you have like that error ref that you can use to say like, oh, there's an error, let's handle it with watching that. And that's usually a good option. I think interceptors are mostly interesting for things like, as mentioned before, like these authentication topics. Oh, you're not authenticated anymore. Maybe you also want to do something, not only showing an error, but maybe you want to redo the request before fetching a new access token with the refresh
Yeah,
token, something like that. That's also everything you can do there.
especially for like global behavior like that, where you want this to happen for every single time you fetch, not like always checking the error you get back and then having to like implement extra logic. You can just like bake that in to that abstraction there and just, you know, not worry about it.
Exactly. That's what's the most common use cases there for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so in doing some research for this episode, I noticed that there was this new config flag in Vue 3.5, which I missed, and it's the app.config.throw unhandled error in production. So my initial assumption was that this one was for, you know, if you're trying to debug some sort of error. Normally in production, those errors are silent and they just get put into the console. But Alex did a little more digging and figured out that there was a linked issue for that.
Yeah, exactly. So it was actually more about the server side errors. So when you do SSR and there's like the render to string method, like really low level from Vue, that's basically saying, okay, take that component tree and render it as an HTML string, then that could fail, right? That could error. And in production, these errors are just swallowed. So while Nuxt has a way already built in to deal with that and show your error page because, well, there's Nitro behind it and so on, so on. Other SSR solutions like Vike, aka a Vite plugin SSR, back in time, I think Vue plugin SSR, but now it's like it's universal. You can build any kind of SSR application with that. Of course, they had a little bit less around it, and when there was an error, there was a blank page, so that was a problem. And with that little addition, that at least was fixed, and now there's an actual throwable error, so they can react to it and show the good old "hey, nothing works anymore" error page, which is better than a blank page for sure.
Mm-hmm.
So it's also something which you as a user probably won't enable straight away. That's more something maybe the like Vike will enable that for you with the settings, or it's like, okay, if you want a behavior, you can try it out. But when using Nuxt, you probably won't need it because there's a solution working already.
Yeah, so let's move from like the more bigger picture kind of global errors down to more fine-grained errors where we can actually look at errors on the component level and handle them on the component level. So the benefit here is that we can have much more localized error messages and ways of recovering from those errors. So instead of your entire application just kind of dying and throwing up a cat gif, we can have, you know, like some widget on the page doesn't load for whatever reason and that fails, but the rest of your app is still working fine and you can, you know, have like a retry mechanism or something like that.
Exactly. I mean, it would be a shame if you have like a big application, let's say e-commerce, and you try, I don't know, to load your wish list and the wish list microservice in the backend for whatever reason has a hiccup and your whole application fails. So that would be a problem. Instead, you just say, hey, I can't load the wish list right now, try again or try later or whatsoever. So that's really that component level, let's say error handling. That's pretty neat. Also, one term that comes to my mind is graceful degradation there. So like, okay, we have problems, but the mission critical systems are still running. So parts of our application might not work, but a big part is still good to go. So that's definitely a pattern for bigger applications to embrace, just to make sure they are a bit more resilient and, well, not that brittle and just crash because maybe also some random third party because like, oh, nope, doesn't work, goodbye. So definitely a pattern to adopt. And that's really the sweet spot between like these request-based, super like fine-grained solutions, which you do with like a try catch or watching the error property, and everything is broken. So if you haven't built it into your application, that might be a good time to raise that with your team, or if you work alone, then bring it in.
Vue gives us this lifecycle hook called onErrorCaptured, which basically is exactly what it sounds like. If you have this, you can capture the error and then do something with it. So it's effectively like this try catch, but for your component. And you can decide to return false, I believe, and then it will continue to throw the error. And you can say, not going to handle this one. But it still lets you do some sort of handling on that. And one thing that's important to keep in mind, and the docs state this as well, is that you have to make sure that when you catch that error, you don't reset, fix the error, but then immediately re-render the thing that caused the error, because then you can get into this infinite loop of reset the error, throw an error, fix the error, throw an error, back and forth, and then that's not really what you want, I don't think.
Hopefully not. Otherwise, you don't like your users that much. One tiny thing, I think, like when you return false and on error capture, then it's a bit like the error won't bubble up further. It's just like, okay, it's handled, I think. So then that should be fine. But yeah, it's a really nice functionality more and more people should use. And if using Nuxt, then you might not even have to use it, because then you can use the NuxtErrorBoundary, which is more or less a wrapper around that on error captured hook. It's used under the hood. Then the Vue error hook, which is a Nuxt hook, right? Not the lifecycle hook of Vue, is called with that error, so the whole app knows about it if you want to. And there is this local error stage, so you can even say, okay, if there's an error, render this fallback component. You can also do it in plain view. It's just a bit more effort. And you can do it on the client side, of course, not a problem. And you can even have, with the scope slot, that clear error method. So in your error component, you can say, hey, let's retry. Then you can clear the error and we can continue the whole process. Of course, then if it fails again, the error slot is shown again. And you kind of avoid at least the problem of like that infinite loop because you have a fallback component.
Yeah, I'd recommend you check out how this component is implemented. We have a link to it in the show notes, as always. And it's like 30 lines of code, including all of the Nuxt hooks and the SSR and hydration stuff that it's accounting for. So if you wanted to implement your own just in Vue for your own application, so you can just like have this error boundary component, it's not too difficult to implement and to figure out what's going on there.
100%. Also recommended. It's a really nice pattern. And in the end, you would build something like that anyway when you really use it to say like, oh, I want to render a fallback, and then you have it abstracted nicely. So yeah, definitely worth a read. And besides these two ways that are more or less the same one, a bit more abstracted in the lower level, Vue has also a way for asynchronous components. And we talked about suspense in the last episode as well. You might also already use it if you await something in your component, no matter if you use Nuxt or Vue. And if you define a component as an async component, which is more common in Vue because in Nuxt you get the abstraction around it already, right? Then you can even say, okay, I'll pass in like a timeout and then an error. So in case, I don't know, the API takes too long or even throws an error, as a Vue developer, I can show a component as like, oh, that didn't work out. Here's my error component. So that's also a way, only works, of course, for asynchronous components, but makes sure that if the whole component doesn't load, then you have that fallback, which can be helpful. By the way, same works also with a loading or like a placeholder component too. And yeah, then from there, we go already to a very, very, very fine-grained level, which is, well, more or less the request-based situation. So I think most of us know that scenario. You send a form, right? Like some form data over to your backend. And then the classic thing, oh, validation error, right? Even though you do form validation in the front end, maybe that can differ and all that. So you get maybe back 400, 422, whatsoever. And you want to deal with that. So of course you don't want to show a whole error page there because, well, the error is kind of clear. So commonly what you do, try catch, have some kind of error ref, and then you're good to go. You will fill it up. Then you have a way to clear that either automatically or when the next time you send things. There are some patterns here that can be really nice because like error state is always a bit tricky, and front-end validation for the form is always like, should you validate forms straight away when your user's typing something? Should you do it after they leave the field, and so on and so on? But the same idea with the backend validation, like how long should the error stay? Should it be longer? Should it be for a couple of seconds? I personally am always a friend of making that as expressive as possible. So just say like, oh, an error, here's that and that field. I can highlight the field, of course. That's a problem. And then say, try basically fix that and try again. And when they try again, hopefully the error is gone.
Yeah, it's always good to have like these extra try catches, not extra, but like around your requests and things like that. You can also, like with most fetching libraries, have some error handling state with it. So if you're using ofetch, which I tend to use if I'm in the Nuxt world, I'll import ofetch, and it has like a nice little error thing you can check. I think Axios, it's been a while since I've used Axios, but
it has it too. Yeah,
it has it too, where you can just, if error, then do this thing. And so if you get an error from the API, then you can handle it nicely.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you use the plain fetch API, so no wraparound, it's always like, oh, you have to check if the response is okay, and if not, then you fail. So if there's any network issues, you're still going to try catch, and you don't even get there, and so on and so on. And like with ofetch, it's really nice because try catch, you have the error, you say like, if that's the instance of that, go for it. So TypeScript is happy as well because technically you can just throw 42 in your application. Please never do this, and it will throw that, so we never know what actually comes out there. And also when it comes to validation, things like parsers, right, like Zod, Valibot, and so on are immensely helpful. First of all, to make sure that the results are actually what you expect and also type safe. And of course, also to deal nicely with errors, because then you have your schema and say, oh, that schema doesn't fit. Now you know exactly what the problem is. So that's definitely a big plus there.
And yeah, in Nuxt, we do fetching with useFetch and useAsyncData. Also $fetch, we covered that a little bit before. And yeah, you get that error state out that you can check. I think recently there was some updates on how the error was typed, I believe. I'm a little fuzzy on those details.
Yeah, for Nuxt 4, like that's correct. Usually, like you get data and error and like the state in general out of these composables. So you can say either data or error is filled because, well, you can't have both at the same time. And then right now, like it could be null or undefined, so like nullish. And in Nuxt 4, I think it's only null. I also like, it's always, I don't know, identify, but there's definitely one. Check out the Nuxt 4 migration guide because you can opt into these things already if you're using Nuxt. That's definitely worth looking into. And yeah, from there, you can decide, as said before, like you can watch the error, say, hey, okay, this, I want to rethrow, say the component, now that doesn't work. Maybe I just want to change parameters. Maybe I just want to log something and it's okay. So you have all the full control. Because just because a request fails, it doesn't mean that the component has to error. Same with like the form request, right? Then it's totally fine to just log that out and you're good to go. But yeah, besides that, I think error handling is something that a lot of developers don't really have, like, let's say, as their first priority, which I kind of get. Like, you want to make it work, you're going for the happy case, but especially when users come in and then like, oh, they click on a wrong button or like a wrong order that it's not the happy path and then things crash. You really want to make sure, first of all, that like you log the errors somewhere, you track them, because maybe you never know. Maybe there's even a browser incompatibility thing you have never heard of, and without a proper error tracking tool, you don't know because you're not using the browser, right? Maybe you're just in your Chrome and in Safari, things break. You'll never figure out maybe until your client calls you angrily like, hey, on my laptop, the shop doesn't work. What's with all my customers? And yeah, you really want to avoid that.
Or what happened with me, like the first thing I pushed at my one job, and then I thought it was great, but then someone tweeted at the company that this thing was broken with a screenshot, and never gonna forget that one.
Yeah, these are always like the scenarios where error handling, of course, keeps in super handy, but of course also the whole type of like, okay, code reviewing, actually testing the feature and so on. So there are a lot of things going hand in hand, but especially like, even if you don't have time for like an intensive test, if you don't have a test suite, you should add one for sure, but then at least error handling will tell you the problems before the people are sending screenshots to your company's Twitter or like calling your client and they call you angrily. So that's always a way to be better better safe than sorry. Plus, a lot of these tools have really, really generous free tiers. And for example, Sentry is also open source, can even be self-hosted. So you're kind of good to go with that. Just make sure that's tracking everything, and also that you track all these server-side errors as well. So if you use Nitro with an API, also worth to hook in there. There's also, we can mention that too, a hook, and actually our hook, to make sure, okay, if there's any kind of problem, just log it out straight away. Make sure you ignore all the 404s maybe, and maybe also the 400s, 422s for validation stuff, just because you probably don't want to have them logged in. Sometimes even people say, yeah, let's leave these in, because if that happens so often, then maybe there's a problem with a form, because you have that in the front end, right? Or like people are confused. So sometimes that could be good, at least for the validation part. So that's definitely also something to keep track of if you're using SSR, or if you also maintain an API, to make sure you have the tracking on both sides, because both are points of failure, so to say.
Yeah, and these tools, you can also often have like pretty good filtering of these. So if you want to filter those out for the most part, you can set that up in your dashboard or whatever.
Exactly. And yeah, I think that's a really nice overview about what's possible when it comes to error handling in Vue and in Nuxt, and a little bit in Nitro as well. We could probably also like dive deep into like, oh yeah, what's with like suspense errors, but we even covered that with the error component there. So if there's anything that you are maybe missing in the Vue ecosystem when it comes to errors, let us know. Write us a message, a comment somewhere on all social media platforms where we are, or DejaVue is at, and we'll definitely read through them and answer. So really curious if there's something like, oh, this is a problem, we really need that. Yeah, maybe there's a solution out there.
Yeah, I think the hardest part about handling errors is actually handling the errors, and it's not as much about like configuring it or putting in like try catches, but just remembering to do it, which is the same with like testing or accessibility or like all these other things that like can feel like extra things where you're like, okay, I finished my feature, and
It's
then you're
done.
like, wait, no, I have to like, I'm only like, a third done. I've got to do all these other things to like make it, to actually finish it and make it production ready.
But as you mentioned, like, yeah, a lot of these things are for us like extras, while that should be part of it. And that should be part of your sprint planning, thinking about it, like estimating story points or feature points or whatever, viewpoints, whatever you estimate. Because like it should be part of it. Otherwise, you'll pay the cost later, or your client will pay cost later. The latter is always the worst, of course, because if you have to, in the end, okay, that might be a bit more like more hours, not too nice. But yeah, if there's like business value that's ruined, that would suck big time.
Yeah.
So that's true. But you won't believe how often I see it in applications when there is no error handling, or just like a console log. And same for accessibility. I reviewed an application recently where they still use like anchor tags with an href set to a money sign, like hash, instead of like a button. Where I'm like, what? Why? What? There's a button element, and that's like the 101 of semantic HTML.
Yeah. Buttons that look like links and links that look like buttons. I've seen both, and
Over, not a good idea. Have a component for that. Like, come on, just add a component that can do both, and then use that, especially for styling as well. Like, actually, same for headings and typography, right? Released a video on that, I think 2 weeks ago when it airs. So like, just abstract it away and never have to worry about it. We'll just work and have all the stylings there, and you don't have 50 buttons that look all different. So yeah, that's it's really helpful to do that. And then don't forget the error handling.
And that's it for this episode on error handling. I hope that you enjoyed it. And as always, check out the show notes for all the links and everything else. Check out previous episodes if you missed any. We've got a bunch of great people on, a bunch of great topics that we've talked about. And we will see you next time.
Exactly. Until then, folks. See ya.